We are working on enhancing the Hungry Traveling Snake project from the WiByte Python curriculum available at www.wibyte.in. Notice this game looks quite normal. My snake is eating its food, like earlier, but this has a very interesting feature where if I try to eat my own tail, the snake will in fact die. Let me try to demonstrate that. Notice this is what happens. I call it a self goal. Snake ate its own tail and it died. Now, a lot of snake games are in fact built with this feature. Let's see how this can be done in our project in this video. In fact, the idea to do this is not hard at all. It's much like, what we have done, for example, for the poisonous fruit. All we have to do is to figure out once the length of segments becomes more than a certain number. Now, remember, segments is all the foods that have been eaten. Once a food is eaten, it becomes part of this list segments. So I wait for this list to become a certain length, let's say more than 5 or say more than 4. At that point, I check if the distance between the snake head and the last segment. Now, notice segments is a list. Segment minus 1 basically is the last segment. That's the end of the tail. If this distance becomes less than 20, I say, well, look, the game is getting over because I've hit a self goal or I've eaten my own tail. And really, all I do is to set the game over to true. Now, this, like I said, is very similar to what we did, for example, with poison. This itself is okay, but still a little bit of thought is required as to where in the code should we put it. Now, for that purpose, we'll have to think a little bit more about the snake movement. In fact, you've seen this before while developing the game. But let's just recall, the snake head and the tail moves every zero point 0.1 second. And this happens inside the while loop, the main while loop for the program. And this also happens in the following order. First, all the segments except the one next to the head move forward, which means there's a momentary overlap between segments, but then the segment that was just next to the head again moves, and it moves to the position of the head. Once again, however, there's a momentary overlap between the head and the first segment, and then the heads move forward. Now, this is sort of how the game is working. It's kind of important to understand how this whole thing is coming together. Clearly, the head direction depends on the arrow keys. Now, just to sort of illustrate this, a little bit. Basically, let's say my snake is going straight, going say from left to right, and I click the down arrow. Now, what has to happen is the next 0.1 second head must go down, but this will in fact happen in a few stages. First, like I said, these 4 segments will move forward, which means there'll be a momentary overlap. This first segment will be missing, momentarily. Of course, the next moment we will have, these, and then the head will disappear because this will go and overlap with the head, and finally the head will appear. So it will look like the snake has turned left, but all this has happened. Now, if I go, let's say another, go down and then turn left. So same thing will happen again. First, these 4 will go and overwrite the top one. Then the head will get overwritten, and finally head will appear. Now, one more left, and let's say I go up. At this point, there will be a self goal created because my head is going to hit the tail. The reason I'm showing you this is because I want to highlight that a self goal will be detected best provided I check for the condition touching between the tail and the head before the tail is moved forward. Remember, the tail is moved first. So if I can do all this check before the tail is moved forward, I will be able to detect a self goal, and which is why I argue that we should place this code at the beginning of the while loop. And this is quite interesting. That's what we are going to do. So let's now add this to our code. Now, like I said, we are going to do this at the beginning of the while loop. Other than that, the code is very similar to what we've done, for example, for the poison. So I'll just take, let's say, this piece of code over here and copy it up there because, it's simpler that way. So I just come up here all the way to the top of the while loop. And I say, look, if my length of segments is, let's say, more than 4, or say we can make it more than 5. If that is the case, then I look for the distance between the turtle head or the snake head and, let's say, segments, say -1, because remember, segments list contains all the segments that are in the tail. Segment -1 is the last one. And if this happens, I will set my game mode to true. Just be careful with the indentations here, a little bit different from the earlier ones. So I just have to make sure all of this gets indented. All this indentation happens, and this is what we need to do, right? So basically here, I'll write this instead of report poison, I'm going to write, let's say, self goal. Now let's see this working, and then we can see how we can enhance it and make it even more interesting. when I run this code, so let me first eat up a few items so that the tail becomes a bit long. Say, it was quite easy because I got many of them together. Let's just eat this as well, eat this as well, eat this. Oops. Go and let's say eat this. And now I'll try to create a self goal. Okay, this time it did not quite happen. Okay, it's sometimes quite hard to create one. Notice I managed to hit my head to the tail and I indeed got a self goal. Now, as you might have noticed just now, sometimes the head would kind of go over the other segments and not still detect a self goal. And the reason for that is we are looking for the touching condition between the head and the last part of the tail. And that brings me to a very natural improvement for this. Now, a very natural improvement for this is to say, okay, look, instead of, just checking for the last segment, why don't I check for all the segments that are, starting from, let's say, 1 going to the end of the list. Now, remember, list indexing starts on 0. So when I'm doing list KK in range 1 to length segments, I'm really checking item 1, 2, 3, 4, same as item -1. However, I'm not checking for segment 0 because segment 0, as we saw just now, is always in contact with the head. So we can't be doing this for segment 0. If for any of these we find that, look, the head is coming too close to it, I can declare that, look, the game has to get over, because it means that not just the end of the tail, but the snake is actually touching the tail somewhere, right? So we can do this. This will be a pretty interesting improvement. So I get back to my code over here. Again, I say if length of segments is, let's say, more than 5, I just run a for loop here. I say, look, for KK in range, I'm doing from 1 to, say, length of segments. Remember, it's start and stop is what I was specifying. And the last value is always the stop -1. So I just say length of segments. And what I check is, well, if segments dot, t dot distance segments, let's say KK, yeah, is say less than 20, then game over is true. I have to indent this. I have to indent all of this again. And basically I just write this whole thing. So this has made it a little bit more, let's say, robust, and also a little bit more strict, I would say, because now it's no longer just the last part of the tail, but the entire tail. If we touch, we expect the game to get over. Let's test this. Now let's see this working. Perhaps I'll first eat several fruits so that it's kind of easy to we kind of get into the zone where this touching condition happens, the self goal condition happens. So let me just go and eat, let's say, 8 fruits. So 8 fruits, and now we'll try to create the touching condition. So I do this. Notice immediately I got a self goal here. Let's try this once again. So again, I will eat, let's say, 8 fruits. Notice this time, in fact, I did not hit the end of the tail. I hit somewhere in the middle and there was a self goal created. So that's exactly what I meant to do through this, and this is quite cool. Before I wrap this up, it's interesting to just do a brief compare and contrast with what we did in the Scratch Snake game. Remember, there clone ID became our indication. Clone ID more than 10 or say more than 5 is where we started touching snake condition, and we broadcast the game. So it's kind of similar here. We are using the list, indexing into the list, but we had to do a lot more work to analyze where to put this code. Whereas in Scratch, this was a forever loop running sort of in parallel. So it was always happening in some sense, right? So it's a little bit easier than sense, but here we have to do more thinking. Also, clearly there's no touching snakehead command. We are using t.distance. Kind of similar, but not exactly the same. And that's interesting. I hope you found this interesting. And in general, if you think this way of learning by building activities, thinking through them, making them interesting, enhancing them is your cup of tea, look at our website, because we have many, many, many such activities that you can benefit from. We learn Python programming through such fun activities. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.